TD Bank Group says it's shutting down some accounts to comply with sanctions against Tehran. Dozens of Iranian Canadians are being cut off from their money.
You can go outside and don't have to worry about getting bit.
And summer is here, but the bugs aren't. The annual mosquito scourge has yet to arrive in Winnipeg, but no one's complaining. Canadian banks really want your business. They're trying to win customers with special offers and improved service. But not everyone's money is welcome. Some Iranian Canadians were shocked to find out that TD Bank Group had recently closed their accounts because of sanctions against Iran. Kaveh Shahrooz is Vice President of the Iranian Canadian Council, and he joins me now. So, Kaveh, let's first of all talk a little bit about the scope of this. Do you have any sense of how many Iranian Canadians have been affected by this?
You know, it's kind of hard to tell. We've been hearing stories of this for the past couple of months. The stories have risen dramatically in number in the last couple of weeks. Our organization, the Iranian Canadian Congress, recently had a fact-finding session where we had a very large turnout. But again, the exact numbers are very hard to determine. TD Bank is remaining pretty tight-lipped about this.
So what exactly has happened?
As far as we can tell, by talking to members of our community and hosting that fact-finding event, loyal customers of TD would either not receive any indication at all, but they would show up at the bank machine and be told that they can't withdraw any money, or they would receive a letter saying that your bank account is being closed, please come into the branch and, you know, here's a check, go on your way and bank elsewhere.
So there are Iranian Canadians who have money in TD bank accounts and they're not able to take that money out?
No, our understanding is, you know, they would be denied, for example, at the bank machine, but then they would be able to actually go to the bank branch, get their money and go bank with another bank.
And has there been any kind of explanation in terms of letters that have been sent, in terms of when they go to the bank and all of a sudden the teller says, here's all your money, go away?
As far as we can tell, two types of letters were sent out to people. One type gave no explanation whatsoever. Another type of letter made a pretty vague and cryptic reference to the Special Economic Measures Act, which is the Canadian law that imposes sanctions on Iran.
So what do you think about that in terms of, you know, because as far as you know, there are no other banks that have done anything like this. So what's your sense of TD's actions?
Unfortunately, it's really hard to have a sense of TD's actions. TD refuses to talk about this. They haven't really given any explanation as to why those particular bank accounts were closed. We've talked to people whose bank accounts were closed, and they've consistently said that they've had no transactions with Iran whatsoever. There's a point that I think is worth making here, something that we want to emphasize, our organization and members of our community. We have no problem with TD Bank or the Canadian government punishing or sanctioning the Iranian government and its agents. And make no mistake about it, the Iranian regime is a brutal tyranny and it should be punished.
And the vast majority of Iranian Canadians would agree with your statement.
I would hope so. I would think so. But where we get worried, and I think members of our community are worried, are people that have no affiliation with that government, with that brutal government that they've escaped from. When they start getting affected and they start having their bank accounts closed and their services denied to them, that's when we get worried.
Is it complicated by the fact that, for example, some Iranian Canadians have property in Tehran? So in a sense, is TD Bank just not following the letter of the law that's been implemented by the Canadian government by closing these accounts?
Well, some Iranians have property in Iran and they send money over, but there are exemptions in the sanctions law that permit people to have some financial transactions with Iran as long as you're below a certain monetary threshold. And in this case, again, TD simply hasn't given an explanation as to why they've decided to close certain bank accounts.
So the Canadian Bankers Association, they issued a statement saying that individual banks, that they're taking steps to comply with Ottawa's sanctions against Iran. They're doing what they think is appropriate. What do you say to that?
What I'd like to say to them, again, is that, you know, we are not trying to make life easier for the Iranian government. I think life should be very difficult for the brutal Iranian regime. Life should not be made more difficult for vulnerable Iranians, pensioners, students, and so on. And I think there should be a process in place where if somebody's bank account has been closed, they can come forth and clear their name if they actually haven't violated sanctions.
Well, you've probably been speaking to people who have gone through this experience. How has this affected their lives by having their bank account suddenly closed?
I mean, I think there's been two sets of effects. One has been financial. You know, people have pre-authorized payments, for example, and once their bank accounts gets closed, those are affected. They take a financial hit. But I think there's a bigger emotional issue where people feel like they're being treated as second-class citizens. They're treated under a cloud of suspicion. They're not allowed to clear their names. And that's, I think, something that's really very upsetting to our community.
Now, you have other banks to choose from, but are you worried about a domino effect? Are you worried that all of a sudden, you know, one's done it, then the others are going to follow?
Absolutely. That's certainly a concern for me and the rest of our community.
And so what will happen next? What are you going to try and do to, I guess, convince these banks that, in fact, there's got to be some leeway here, that Iranian Canadians should be able to open up a bank account, have their mortgage paid through a bank, get a mortgage through a bank, and all the normal things that everyday Canadians do?
You know, we're following several different avenues. One is just media outreach, letting the larger Canadian community know that this is happening to the Iranian Canadian community. We're going to be reaching out to lawmakers to let them know that this is happening. But also, primarily, we're reaching out to TD itself and asking them for an explanation. I have every faith that TD is not actually out to harm our community. And I think as long as we let them know that vulnerable people are being hurt, that they will come around and they'll change this.
We're almost out of time, but final quick question to you. You're saying you're reaching out to Canadian legislators. Have you spoken to MPs? Have you spoken to...
We're starting that process.
Starting that. All right. Yeah. Good to talk to you. Thanks very
Likewise.
much.
Thank you very much.
Kaveh Shahrooz is Vice President of the Iranian Canadian Council. We contacted Toronto Dominion Bank and requested an interview, but the bank has yet to respond. Time now for a check on how the markets are performing. The TSX is seeing modest gains in New York. The Dow and the NASDAQ are trading a little lower. And here's a quick look at the Canadian dollar and commodities as well.